Friends, without any further ado, since all of our speakers for this afternoon are on board, let us begin. So let me begin by welcoming all of the participants on behalf of the three co-organizers, that is Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, ISID based in New Delhi, and the Cambridge University Press. And and this is what I can see from the screen is there's a group of all old friends interested in industrialization and development. So I'm sure it is going to be a very, very interesting discussion. However, there is a little bad news. This morning, Professor R. Radhakrishna, who a very distinguished economist that India has produced, he passed away. This is a very bad news that happened this morning. So I thought of, before beginning our today's discussion in this webinar, I thought we could pay a little tribute to him and observe a 1-minute silence. I don't need to remind anyone that Professor Radhakrishna has had many, many achievements. I mean, I went through his, I was broadly aware of his achievements and accomplishments, but I wanted to be doubly sure, and I discovered many that I had overlooked. So he has, his sort of profile reads like, he has served in all different capacities as member secretary of ICSR, vice chancellor of Andhra University, Director and Vice Chancellor of IGIDR, Chairman of National Statistical Commission, Chairman of MIDS, and Padmani is there. Of course, she reminded me of that also. And the Chairman, latest position, of course, he had was this Chairman of CES, this Center for Economic and Social Studies in Hyderabad, and where he was also an honorary professor. And he had served on many, many national committees and UN agencies and, all kinds of, very distinguished contributions he has made to the profession of economics, development economics in India. And so I think his passing away is a big loss for all of us. And so I thought we could observe 1-minute silence in his honor and, offer our condolences to him, his family, his colleagues, and all others, friends of Professor Radhakrishnan. So 1 minute from now. Thank you. So now going back to this discussion of today, I think the discussion is about this theme of industrialization for employment and growth in India. And I think if you look around and think what is the most pressing, most critical, most important development challenge that India faces today, it is job creation. Our inability to create adequate number of decent jobs is behind the pervasive informality of the country, the persisting poverty of the country, and all other development problems can be linked one way or the other to our inability to create enough decent jobs for 12 million people who join the workforce in India every year. So I think this is a very timely analysis because it focuses attention on what can be done to increase decent jobs through industrialization. And when you talk about industrialization, it takes your mind to the structural transformation. India has had a very substantial structural transformation in the sense that in agriculture dominated economy was transformed into a services dominated economy, but bypassing industry, especially manufacturing in that process. And so this has, of course, this transformation towards services has given to India very robust growth over the past years, but it has not been able to lift the people from agriculture economy to higher productive sectors. So just to give you one number, services account for 56% of India's GDP, but only accommodate 26% of the workforce. So where would the rest of the people be finding jobs? They stay with the agriculture, and they have not been able to find more productive, more value-adding jobs for themselves. So there comes this issue of industrialization that we have missed the boat in this process. And now, finally, Government of India is waking up to the potential of manufacturing and is trying to catch up with the potential of manufacturing through Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat programs. So in that context, I think this book is most timely addition to the literature that has been edited very recently by Professor Nagaraj, and has been supported very well by the Ford Foundation, and has been published very well by Cambridge University Press. So I think this book raises some of the issues, especially on the importance of small firm clusters around the country. And so we will hear from Nagaraj about the book. But before I turn to Nagaraj, I want to invite Professor Sunil Mani, my very old and very distinguished friend, who is currently a director of CDS, and he has been a professor at CDS for many, many years. He was also at the UNU Intact, which became UNU Merit later on, where we both worked, but not together, but one after the other. So Sunil actually succeeded me in UNU Intact. So we go back a long time, in our sort of formative years when we were doing both PhDs in our respective places. So from that time, we have known each other. So, Sunil will talk about the background to this book and his insights into this. And he is also one of the contributors to the book. So over to you, Sunil.
Okay, first of all, I think I must thank the Institute for Studies in Industrial Development, and specifically Nagesh Kumar, my old colleague, and for giving us a chance to organize this book discussion of this very important theme of promoting employment through industrialization, which Nagaraj and the other colleagues who have contributed to this book. The way I'm going to do this is basically to reflect over three issues which provide a kind of a systematic background to this book. The first issue that I thought about is what is happening to labor intensity of manufacturing in India. And there was a very influential paper, highly cited, which was published somewhere in 2014, authored by Kunal Sen and Dev Kusum Das, who took a bunch of typically labor-intensive manufacturing industries, such as cotton textiles, garment making, leather and leather manufacturers, woodworking, furniture, and so on. And they worked out the ratio of number of workers to fixed capital stock in these typically labor-intensive firms over a 30-year period, starting from the 1980s until the 2000s. Okay. And they found a very interesting result, which was counterintuitive, that all of these labor-intensive industries, there are about 13 of them, had become less labor-intensive over the years. For instance, the labor intensity of manufacturing, defined in the way that I mentioned before, was something like 3.38 during the 1980s. It came down to 0.78 during this period. In other words, even the so-called labor-intensive industries in India were becoming capital-intensive over the years. Okay, so that's the first issue in our background, because when the government, and so on, as Nagesh said, is thinking in terms of promoting employment through the manufacturing road, it is assumed that we have, because of our abundant labor supply and cheap labor cost, this could be done through labor-intensive manufacturing. But unfortunately, the bad news is that labor-intensive manufacturing is becoming capital-intensive over the years. That's the first point. The second one is even the so-called capital-intensive industries are becoming more capital-intensive. They are substituting new technologies which is supposed to shed labor. So there is all kinds of automation which is going on in the typically capital-intensive manufacturing industries as well. Okay. Of course, this automation, that when you talk about, there is a hierarchy of technologies. It can mean use of conveyor belts or forklift truck inside a factory, to use of industrial robots. And there was this study which was published in 2013, very highly cited, more than 5,000 citations if you do a Google search, and by Frey and Osborne, which said that the possibility of automation is going to be very high, and that is going to have a deleterious effect on manufacturing employment, not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries. Okay, and so that was the second issue in the background, which Nagaraj and his colleagues have actually examined. The third one is the whole public policy instrument of using cluster as a tool for creating manufacturing employment. Clusters are basically geographical concentration of seeming units, which firms which produce seemingly similar kind of products. Okay. Now these clusters, as we know, are some of these clusters are historically evolved. For instance, the garment cluster in Tripur or the lock cluster in Aligarh, etc. Nobody set them up. They just sprung up on one fine morning and evolved over a period of time. And they have been extremely labor intensive, and they use local materials and local labor, and they have been very beneficial and have had good spillover, positive spillover effects to their neighborhood. Then, of course, you have public policy induced or created clusters, which are quite recent, and a number of them have sprung up, especially in IT services, for instance. You have a number of these clusters which have established inside technoparks and so on. Okay. Now, the basic belief is that these clusters, generally speaking, whether it is historically evolved or created through public policy making, are very much, provide various kinds of employment, either low-skilled employment or high-skilled employment, but they are typically employment intensive. Okay. And also, they are supposed to be very innovative, because you find that knowledge flows within clusters are easy because of the short distance which is involved in the location of these firms. But this also has been belied by actual facts, because if you look at many of these clusters, some of these clusters have disappeared, and they are not typically very innovative from that point of view also. Okay. And many of those clusters have also become much more labor intensive over the years. Okay. So the whole issue of promoting employment through the manufacturing road seems to be under some cloud of suspicion. Okay. So this is the suspicion that is being taken up and very systematically analyzed through several case studies in this book. Okay. Now, I don't talk too much about the book itself, because I think Nagaraj is going to talk about, But you can see that there are very interesting clusters in automobile parts, in garment making, ceramic clusters, sports equipment, lock manufacturing, foundries, and leather. Okay, so I think let's hear from Nagaraj now about how labor intensive, or has these clusters become more capital intensive as a general labor intensive manufacturing firms have become. Okay, so now I think over to Nagaraj.
Thank you, Sunil, for highlighting the trends in the labor intensity of both labor intensive and capital intensive industries, and the suspicion it causes about the potential of manufacturing for creating jobs. I think this is a very important issue. However, one thing we need to also keep in mind is the extensive forward and backward linkages that manufacturing sector has, which are higher than any other productive sector. So the employment creation by manufacturing is not only the direct employment creation, but also indirect one. But that is something, I'm sure will come up in the discussion. But let me turn to Nagaraj to talk about the book, what was covered and why, and and how, and what are the lessons he is getting from this extensive analysis, which he conceived and assembled a team of researchers to take it up systematically across the country. So I want to really invite Nagaraj to talk about it. And I don't think anybody in this audience needs any introduction of Professor Nagaraj. He has been writing about industry for all the years I have been reading any economic stuff. So he has been a very consistent, analyst of industrial development in the country. And I think his insights, one really looks forward to benefiting from. So over to you, Nagaraj.
Thank you, Nagesh. Thank you, Sunil, for this warm introduction. I thank both the institutions, ISID and CDS, for organizing this book discussion. I'm delighted to share basically a flavor of the research which is contained in the book. Obviously, I cannot cover the details. So I will make my presentation, a very short presentation. I will, just a minute, I will share the, is it clear? Can people see it?
Yes, we can see this. But okay, if you can put it on
yes,
presentation mode.
Yes, I'm doing. Is it clear?
It is still not coming on the presentation mode, but it is clear. I think you can.
Sir, press F4, F5.
So,
F5.
F5.
Presentation mode.
No, I'll go back and do it again.
Now you can do it again.
F5. No. Or maybe I'll go back and do it again. What do you suggest?
Otherwise, bottom right presentation mode is there.
I did that.
He tried to press that, but he did.
Just a minute. Now I'll bottom right. No.
Okay, I think the way you had done it, that is fine.
Okay,
share screen and go ahead on it.
Okay. Share screen.
Yeah, it is perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll first. This is the what motivated us to do this research. First was the industrial stagnation around 2015-16. Manufacturing sector share in GDP had stagnated around 16-17%. And Government of India launched a Make in India program in 2015 with ambitious target. The targets were 100 million new manufacturing sector jobs and manufacturing sector share in GDP to be 25% by 2022. These are the targets set. But the ground reality was quite different. Falling employment. Between 2012 and 2017, 3 million manufacturing jobs were lost. Rising imports of even consumer goods. As we all know, there's a widespread common talk about even Ganesha idols being imported from China. Okay, and sharp slowdown in industrial growth, which many of us have documented. Okay, and rising dependence on China. So these are the concerns when around 2015-16 when we launched this research initiative. Yeah, here are the basic facts. Here the left-hand graph shows the share of manufacturing and industry over a long period. It is 91, 2001, 2013, and 2018. One can see a stagnation. One can see the stagnation, the share of manufacturing or industry in GDP. And for the more recent period, one can see a sharp decline in industrial growth rate. There are two graphs. We have the GVA, there's by national account. Then you have the ASI data, and you have the index of industrial production data. So all of them show a very dismal picture. Okay, and so while this is the picture, there are a lot of ambitious targets being set, but at the ground level, research on MSMEs as a creator of jobs was very little. Unfortunately, the kind of research was done on small industry, say in 70s and 80s, was somehow lost in the more recent period in the context of liberal reforms. So we thought a way would be to go back and initiate industry and location-specific studies. Motivation, inadequate research on how MSMEs, or earlier we used to call it small industry, and industrial clusters are performed. At the ground level, what was happening to them, we did not have much understanding recently. Hence, the need for fresh research to find ways of creating manufacturing jobs. This is the motivation we started off with. Okay, and just to give you a structure of this, India's industrial structure is something which is often forgotten, and I think I mentioned here. We have a dual structure. 2/3 of output is produced by 1/3 of workers in the factory sector by a tiny fraction of establishments. Okay, ASI captures the factory sector very well. Okay, unorganized sector data is poor, and unorganized sector accounts for about 80% of employment and produces about 20% of output. Okay, sorry, it employs about 80% of produces 1/3 of output, employing about 80% of workers. So that's the structure. Okay, and industries are spread across formal and informal sectors. See, very often people who look at only data often miss out the linkages between them. In fact, Sunil mentioned about study by Kunal Sen, and this is a good example of a whole series of studies done in recent past. They have only looked at data from the ASI because the ASI data is available. ASI data today is available at the unit level, so people use it very easily and very intensively. But whereas labor-intensive industries have diffused into the organized sector. So it's a classic case of looking where the light is, not where you have lost the key. Okay, so we wanted to avoid such a problem and look at clusters which contains all firms of all sizes around an industry, around a product. Okay, that's how we went about. Okay, and there are serious issues with MSME data. Okay, registered MSMEs form a modest part of the unorganized manufacturing sector. Only those small firms which are registered with DICs, District Industry Center, get captured in the MSME database. Okay, and which is only a small fraction. Official MSME data is poor. data availability only on number of units, employment, capital employed, as recorded at the time of registration, not updated. This data situation has not improved over the last 3-4 decades. Okay. And MSME conducts census. The Ministry of MSME conducts census, but this is dated and they are one-off efforts. And they are not comparable. The censuses are not comparable over time because their frames are very different. So therefore, we do not have adequate data on MSMEs. And specifically, if you want to look at the clusters or industry specific, the data is even less. No product, industry, or cluster specific databases exist for labor-intensive industries. So these are the actual reality when we started off with. Okay. So what is our research strategy? Ideally, quantitative analysis of desirable to identify labor-intensive industries, like using the kind of data which Kunal Sen has used. Okay, would have been ideal to identify labor-intensive industries. But Kunal Sen data is only about ASI, not about the entire industrial sector. Okay, so therefore, going by that method has its limitations. Instead, we thought of I would say, following Keynes, we're trying to be broad, approximately right, maybe to avoid being precisely wrong. Okay, so we thought we will go by broadly accepted knowledge of MSMEs and labor-intensive industries and invite scholars with prior knowledge and experience of studying MSMEs. I mean, that was the way we thought of attacking the problem. So scholars were identified based on their research by surveying academic literature. Okay. While the scholars were doing the field work, I mean, we invited the scholars, we had a series of workshops before we actually went ahead with the field work. Okay. Then while the scholars were doing the field work, this is mostly during 2018 and 19, I personally visited all the sites barring one to get a first-hand view of the ground reality. I mean, that was my, given my interest from the days of my PhD, that I wanted to go back doing field work. So this is one limited way I tried to do field work, but basically riding on the back of the scholars who were doing the hard work, I just went there to visit them for a few days. So that is how we did the research work. Okay. And this picture shows where the clusters are located. As you can see, they're mostly located in south, west, and north, and two in Calcutta. So the list is here. It's from Jalandhar to Tirupur, and from Morbi to Howrah. That is the spread of clusters we have chosen. And okay, then we come now. I'll tell you very briefly. This is going to be a very brief summary of our findings without any data. It's just very broad sweep of statements I make. Very diverse picture. Very diverse picture. If you see a booming Morbi is a location, is a town, is an industrial town, which specializes in manufacturing ceramic tiles in Gujarat, Rajkot district. Okay, and Rajkot district itself, Rajkot city itself. Okay, they have been booming in whatever they're doing, like ceramic tiles or engineering. These clusters were booming clusters when we visited them. Okay, to stagnant and declining clusters in Howrah, the low-end foundry, Jalandhar, sports goods, or Dharavi, the leather goods. So we found a whole range of experiences. Chinese exports were clearly affected sports goods industry. Manufacturers have turned into importers. Dharavi leather exports collapsed after the boom in 2000s. Okay. Morbi is a very interesting example. I will talk in some detail about it here. Morbi cluster has beaten Chinese threat to retake domestic market and with growing exports. This is a shining example of how India can get back into manufacturing series. Okay. One thing we found, at least this is my while talking to entrepreneurs, going and meeting a large cross section of entrepreneurs, government officers. The best impression I carry is that entrepreneurs didn't worry about imports, though imports are growing, but they were not feeling threatened. But what they felt most was that lack of government support bothered them very much. In fact, this is the impression I took from most of the places where I went. They said, look, we can do as well as Chinese in producing this labor-intensive goods. We are not lacking in anything except that government is not giving us support. If government were to give even a fraction of the support which the Chinese government gives them, they said we can do well. I mean, I thought that's a very optimistic assessment by people who take decisions. I mean, who take decisions. I thought that was very important takeaway from what we found. Okay. Second, moving up the ladder. Okay. Many clusters enterprises have moved up the value chain, from being subcontractors to product manufacturers to branded good producers. This is an interesting. Or within the same location or a cluster, we'll see the entire lot of them. Like if I were to go to Morbi, I think I hope Das is here. Okay, I mean, one could see a large number of relatively smaller manufacturers, or basically subcontractors to all the big branded tile manufacturers in the country. Name any big tile manufacturer in the country which you see in the market. Most of them are manufactured in Morbi. Okay, and also you have own brand manufacturers who manufacture they are developing their own brands. In fact, if you see the newspapers or magazines, you see fancy Italian sounding sanitary ware being advertised. In fact, almost all of them are from Morbi. Okay, so one can see that they have a whole range of goods, and many of them are moving up the ladder, up the value chain. Okay. On the other hand, we found near stationary state in locks in Aligarh, wooden bats and rackets in Jalandhar, or low-end casting in Howrah. Okay, and rising imports in most cases. Howrah, I am not sure, but certainly in the case of Jalandhar and Aligarh, the imports were a serious threat. But entrepreneurs were very clear. They kept saying that if we get the similar kind of a support which Chinese government gives them, we will do as well. Okay, and nowhere we came across people complaining about labor. Okay, so this is and growth and reversal. This is another category. Dharavi provided a very interesting case that Dharavi shot up to global fame during the first decade of the 21st century, when Dharavi, as per international reports, exported up to $500 million worth of goods, of leather products, through most known international brands like Macy's or whatever, the global brands. But after the collapse of the global, after the financial crisis of 2008-9, the market shrank, and Chinese took away the market. Okay, and Dharavi hasn't recovered from it yet. So that's a sad case, but that's true. This is okay. In fact, we kept looking for where is the growth which happened, where are the traces of it. We found it hard to find the traces of that growth. Okay, so that was another case. If Calcutta Garment Cluster is a low-end domestic goods market, it's a stably growing market as our case study shows. Tirupur is a low-end export market. Both, but they are growing clusters, but perhaps not moving up the value chain, but expanding markets. This is interesting. If you go to Tirupur, we found that any manufacturer worth the name in Tirupur would complain about how low the margins are there in the export business, but nobody wants to miss out on the export market because it's a volumes game. Okay, if you get a big order from a big international buyer, okay, that makes the life of that entrepreneur. Okay, so but they're all expanding in scale in terms of volumes, but not in the value. Okay, Calcutta Garment Cluster caters to low-end domestic garment market, and it's a stable and growing market. Okay, so this is a very rough picture. And what I mean, this slide is something which I am presenting because I happen to visit all the clusters in a matter of couple of months, and I could see the picture across the clusters. So I have a comparative picture, which I suppose the individual scholars who did the case studies may not have. So I am presenting this. This is my picture as I observed. Okay, Morbi tamed Chinese imports by well-designed state support. Okay, assured power, dedicated gas pipeline, missionary import from Italy and China, and good road connectivity to Kandla port. I mean, these are something which all the entrepreneurs we visited vouched for. The state has been extremely proactive in providing these facilities. Okay. In addition, I think the anti-dumping duties imposed by the Commerce Minister are helpful, but we could not get, at least I could not get more details on that part. How important was that? I could not figure out. Okay. But Jalandhar, without state support, has languished. I mean, this is exactly opposite of what we found in Morbi. Producing traditional low-end goods for domestic market, basically hockey sticks and cricket bats. Okay, losing export market to China. Okay, demand for newer exports goods like badminton and tennis ceded to Chinese and Taiwanese imports. As you know, in the last 2 decades, there's been a boom in this very urban sports. Like Sania Nehwal created a big demand for badminton in the country, and there's a huge growth of domestic market, but the entire market is met by imports. Okay, and another interesting example, with state support, Tirupur was able to solve the river water pollution problem, whereas Howrah cluster, Howrah foundry cluster, faced a similar pollution control order, but has been lying dormant, with poorly designed alternative state site provided by West Bengal government, 40 kilometers away. It's an interesting example. You have a similar pollution control order by Supreme Court. Okay, one cluster is able to fight back and get back to doing manufacturing and move, whereas the other cluster lies low and barely grows. Okay, so why are these differences? It's clearly because of the lack of state support. Other important thing which we looked at was, what is the kind of academy or industry linkages? Are there any linkages between training institutions, academic institutions, polytechnics, and the local industry? We found an excellent example in Rajkot. Rajkot Industry Association is a very, at least my impression I gathered was that there is a thriving society association which keeps in touch with academics and organizes seminars and conferences for the benefit of its members on the global trade issues, on issues how to deal with China, how to import goods from China. So one can see that lot of information, knowledge was being passed on from academic institutions or associations to actual entrepreneurs in Rajkot. In fact, the local business school had a close association with industry association. The opposite end of it is Dharavi. Dharavi, very interesting. Dharavi has one of the oldest, or say not Dharavi, I would say Bandra has one of the oldest polytechnic to train people in leather technology. It was started in 1930s. And Dharavi is stone's throw, literally, from the Bandra Polytechnic. But both of them have absolutely no connections whatsoever. When we talked to the professors at the Polytechnic, they said they looked down upon Dharavi, saying that they are basically cobblers because they have nothing to do. They are not technologists. They don't process leather. But I told them, look, they are exporting $500 million worth of leather goods produced in international brands. They said it doesn't bother them. So that is the extreme example of lack of connection between academy and industry. Okay, threat of automation. In fact, when we started this program of research, some said we were championing a lost cause. As Sunil mentioned, the Frey and Osborne's book was very widely cited, and the kind of a common perception was, look, labor-intensive industries will get wiped out sooner than later. So why are we picking up to study this now? Okay, so we were very deeply concerned. So in fact, when this concern was raised, Sunil agreed to do a study of this, and which is his chapter gives the details. So he looked at the potential threat of robotics in Indian manufacturing. The main finding is something like this: while there is a threat of automation in the long run, the immediate concerns seem minimal. That was the impression we got from Sunil's study. Most robots in India were used in automotive industry for mainly two functions: painting and welding. And these are very difficult functions which are polluting, which causes problem to workers. So therefore, but they were not something which were displacing labor at that moment. So at least with respect to robots, as of today, the threat of automation seems not very much. I mean, this is a very tentative statement, and this is what Sunil's case study shows. So this is a very brief summary of what the book is about. Okay, then I'll talk about promotional efforts which are required, how the promotional efforts exist. Okay, what I found when I visited 9 to 10 clusters, what I found the most physical infrastructure in these locations. Earlier we used to call them industrial estates. Now they are called industrial parks or clusters. Okay, but whatever you call them, but the industrial infrastructure at the ground level is frozen in the pre-reform era. That was shocking. Okay, there's a lot of change in the nomenclature. Earlier, in the bad old days or good old days of old planning, they used to call us ISIS, small industry, SISI, small industries service institutes, and they service the entire industrial estate. Okay, today they're called cluster officers. They're given executive designations, but what they do has not changed. And their support for the cluster is very minimal, and the infrastructure is pathetic. Okay, so usual problems which we know about, which are reiterated by most clusters, is the poor infrastructure, power, credit, etc. Common problem. Okay, so what I came out of from these studies, what I learned from this study is that need for location-specific state support. Design in collaboration, local industry association and banks. So this is now my last slide here is going to be policy lessons. They take away from our studies. Need to reimagine industrial policy going beyond catchy slogans in a granular fashion. We need to look at in detail industry location specific infrastructure. We need a time-bound plan for upgrading industrial infrastructure focused on industrial location, cluster and parks. What I call the last mile road connectivity calls for urgent attention. Thanks to the road building program, which has been happening for more than 10 years now, more than 20 years now, highways have improved significantly in most places. But you get off the highway, things have deteriorated unimaginably. See, I will share one, one example, not from my case studies, but outside. And you must have heard of Pune is a major auto hub in India. Okay, you can come to Bombay to Pune and Chinchwad in 2.5-3 hours. But for the next 5 kilometers, there's a Chakan, which has about 6 multinational companies producing cars for the domestic and global market. And there, if you want to reach Bajaj Auto Factory, it will take 2 hours. That is I'm talking about this is one of the most well-regarded cluster or automotive hub in the country. And this is the level of local, I would say, last mile connectivity. Okay. I happened to go there in 2019 and I was stuck in front of Bajaj Auto Office, Bajaj Auto Factory for 2 hours to just get out of the place. So that is the level of poor infrastructure. So I needn't explain more on this. Okay. Need for well-designed local level state promotional efforts. I think, see, the point, earlier we had this grand plans made sitting in Delhi. I think we need to go below that level to state and district and at the cluster level and see what needs to be done. And this has to be done in close collaboration with local industry and banks. The bankers have a fairly good understanding of what goes on at the ground level. Okay, so I would think this is what is required. Okay, of course, the point about bank credit is all known, but access to bank credit continues to be a bugbear, for all of us know, especially for micro and small enterprises. And I foresee problems getting worse now. Now, commercial banks have taken a backseat in delivering credit. They have farmed out the last mile job of delivering credit to NBFCs. In fact, there's a co-lending program coming up with agencies like Adani Capital. State Bank has tied up with Adani Capital for the. So my fear is that the delivery of credit to micro and small enterprises are likely to get further affected adversely, because banks have abdicated their responsibility of delivering credit under priority sector or whatever. So I think this is a serious issue which we need to answer. I think what I have given you is just a kind of a flavor of the rich details. Maybe I have done injustice to the case studies which are there, which are very detailed. I hope my introduction will encourage the participants to pick up the book and read. And I would think that the detailed case studies like this provide lots of testable hypotheses, working hypotheses for doing further work. So I hope that this book will give rise to more studies, need not necessarily be case studies. It could be different kind of methods. But the fact is, the questions the book raises should lead to more productive research, as well as hopefully will have positive impact on policy. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nagaraj. I think this flavor that you shared was very rich indeed. And I think the message coming out that infrastructure, bank credit, and all lack of support, etc., are behind why we are not doing well in industry. But one very encouraging message which comes out of your this extensive research conducted in the process of this book production is this Morbi cluster. I mean, it's a shining example of a proactive state promotion covering all different aspects of it can succeed. So I think that should be very much highlighted, that if government wants to get things done, it can deliver results. So I'm sure our 4 panelists, very eminent panelists, will take up some of these issues which have been covered by the book. So let me, thank Nagaraj for sharing this very rich flavor of the book, and turn to the panelists. And the first one on my list is Dr. Srinivasan Iyer, who works at Ford Foundation as Senior Program Officer. And so I'm sure he must have followed this project very closely from his offices. And I'm sure he would share some interesting insights about that. So, Srini, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagesh Kumar. It's wonderful to be here, and Nagaraj, as usual, with a brilliant presentation, has started us off. First of all, before commenting on the report itself, I must confess that I was part of the inception, in a sense, thinking the project in the beginning, and I just want to share a few thoughts that ran through our minds while we were discussing this initiative. as Sunil spoke earlier, we are India's in a very, very difficult situation vis-a-vis employment. Even today, even the Economic Times talks about 200 million lost jobs. I mean, things are getting so bad that even the Economic Times starts sort of highlighting just the sheer number of jobs which they consider missed. And we have had about, say, almost 30 years of reforms, and the structural transformation that we expected would accompany the reforms has not happened. It's only for the first time, I think, in the census 2011 that we noticed that we were kind of plateauing in terms of the number of people in agriculture. Whereas there's a lot of discussion of how do you define the employment problem if we define it as twofold. One, are a majority of our workers on an upward gradient in terms of productivity and retained earnings? And the second is, are a majority of our workers shifting from more informal jobs to less informal jobs, from high precarity to lower precarity? So in a sense, the transformation exercise that we expect in a democratic economy actually should try and capture this twofold movement, one in productivity and the other in the conditions of work. But we see that on both grounds, and particularly if we look at female labor force participation in either in higher productivity jobs or formality, or if we are looking at marginalized communities such as the scheduled tribes and the scheduled caste, the situation is only more abysmal. So it goes from the Economic Times sort of headline of 200 million to even much more dismal stories. Now, what were we? So we pinned our hopes that we will leapfrog. We will, in a sense, leapfrog the manufacturing stage, and we'll go to services. And now, at the end of 30 years of such a position, we are able to say that digitally enabled jobs across, and this is as per NASSCOM's estimation, is just 4 million. We are talking about 4 million in roughly about 480 million strong labor force. So it's minimal. And if we look at the more visible high-end sectors such as finance and business and real estate, they too collectively do not employ more than about 2.5 to 3% of India's workforce. And these are really the sectors, in fact, which have significantly driven growth in India, apart from the highly capital-intensive manufacture. So collectively, these growing sectors, so to speak, which have supported our growth for the past 30 years, would not amount to more than about 40 million jobs, which is why we are in the situation where and therefore we cannot pin our hopes in the high-end services sectors. Now, whereas if we actually look at the income basket of people who are still in agriculture, we notice that there is a significant amount of diversification, but the diversification either seasonally or perennially is either into low-end services or low-end manufacture, such as the brick kilns and these illegal mines, etc., etc. We even see long-scale migration, apart from the older story of construction. So in a sense, while we acknowledge what Sunil said, that manufacturing across the world is turning to be less and less labor intensive, and we also acknowledge another fact, in fact, which was not confronting us so much in the early 90s, which is the emergence of China and subsequently Vietnam, etc. The share of global manufacture upon global GDP, which is now in these new countries in the global south, is much higher. And in some senses, it is the kind of space that we could look at, which we are losing out. So there are two significant reasons why we cannot be as optimistic now as we could have been perhaps in the early 90s that manufacture could lead us through. However, the position is that there is really no alternative. And if we want the workforce to grow up the two gradients of productivity and the quality of jobs, and if services do not offer an opportunity, we have to look at manufacture. So it's even from that perspective, rather than just quote that virtually every country has gone through this, we really have no alternative given our large numbers. And that's really what brought us to this project. Now, the efforts, mainstream efforts to look at employment has also tried to look at skilling, but in our view, it was that skilling was actually placing the cart before the horse, because particularly if one is looking at low to mid skills, in fact, none of the sectors that were surveyed under the study really pushes a lack of skilled labor up on the top. If at all, in fact, the required skilled labor, it was something that was taken in-house or within the cluster. So that's something that bears out, in a sense, the superfluity of the emphasis on skills as the one that could lead employment. So that's something that's ruled out. Then it therefore brought us to a choice between what's called sort of vertical industrial policies as against sort of the horizontal ones. And for very long, our successive sort of economic planners kept emphasizing through, in fact, even if you look at the economic survey of 2018, there was still a continued emphasis despite Make in India on horizontal policies. To a certain extent, what Professor Nagaraj presented, in fact, represents, horizontal policies, such as, the emphasis on infrastructure and the emphasis on bank credit. However, when they went into a sector deep dive, that's when they realized that they need, in addition to the horizontal policies, you also need sector specific or cluster specific or location specific, and I would even add enterprise class specific, set of policies. To a certain extent, when he talked about sort of specifically aimed credit, he actually meant a class of entrepreneurs, which tend to get missed out by the formal sort of lending institutions. So when one gets to sector specific sort of vertical, by vertical, I don't really mean sort of sectors, but it could also be geographies, it could also be types of enterprises. Then one is left with the problem that, and this is, the public sector has been pilloried, that can they really pick winners? Because this is a question of picking winners and designing this thing. One certainly, and then there's a contrary literature, Matsukato being the prime example of mission-driven public interventions. And I think that we as Democrats have to pin our hopes on the potential for such mission-driven interventions, which to go into the kind of detail that Professor Nagaraj and the team have pointed out. And in fact, for me, the sectors actually hold out hope because there are enough glimpses of successes of industrial clusters or enterprises holding out and even overcoming sort of very, very steep challenges. And it's for us to go into detail. What is the quality of entrepreneurship? What is the particular nature of the sector? And what is the nature of mission-driven public interventions which made those possible? And that, in fact, would give us hope, and it would also give greater substance of what public sector interventions are. And I think that itself is a subject of study, including, I would say, the nature of entrepreneurs. Economists have actually been fairly weak in studying the nature of enterprises, the nature of firms. And I think that we need to devote some more attention, because if there are exceptions, and there are numerous exceptions to the otherwise dismal picture, a lot of the times it is the quality of enterprise, both private sector enterprise, which is running the units, and public sector enterprise, which is actually providing the kind of services which Professor Nagaraj said, indeed, in some of these sectors. And it is the nature of that entrepreneurial activity that we need to study deeper. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srini. I think you have highlighted a number of issues, especially, the fact that there is no alternative, for us other than going to manufacturing for creating whatever jobs that can be created. So this criticality, I think we need to bear in mind. And it was also, interesting to hear all different kinds of interventions, whether vertical or horizontal. I think we need all of them, and I'm sure other speakers will pick up some of the issues that you have raised. So thank you very much. Let me turn to our next panelist, Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay. I don't see him on the screen. Partha, are you on board?
Hi, Nagesh. Yes, I am.
Hi, Partha. Yes. So Partha Mukhopadhyay, I think, again, this audience needs no introduction for him. He has been a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and has been a very important contributor to this, literature on economic development on different aspects. And I'm sure he would bring his own deep insights into the subject. So over to you, Partha.
Thank you, Nagesh, for that completely undeserved introduction. And it's one of the really, let me cut straight to the chase. And I think that one of the really important contributions of this particular volume is the fact that it goes deep and it goes wide. It brings together a picture of manufacturing in India, which is rarely seen in both in the kind of depth and in the kind of diversity that is there. So the first thing I think, the lesson that I took away from this volume is the fact that, as Nagaraj himself was concluding, there is no space for manufacturing policy in India. But there is a lot of space for manufacturing policy at various levels of local structures. And that is, I think, a critical difference between China and India that we don't enough appreciate, that the agency of the local Chinese state in supporting their local economies is something that we in India have never actually realized, and still sort of tend to focus much more on, let's say, what's happening in Delhi rather than what's happening in Morbi. So that's the first lesson I took away from this. The second lesson I took away from this sort of links to my work on urban structures, which is that if you're operating in big cities, you have one other major competitor. Fortunately, it has become slightly weaker now, but it's still quite major. It shows up when you read the descriptions of Dharavi. It shows up when you read the descriptions of the Howrah Foundry cluster, in the sense that the alternative use of the land in which that industrial base is. Dharavi operates continuously under the shadow of redevelopment. And therefore, in addition to many other problems that is identified, the entrepreneurs there are reluctant to invest because they're not sure whether or not their entire settlement would be demolished and redeveloped shortly. Similarly, in the Howrah Foundry is a fascinating case, and I'll end when I finish my talk. I'll refer to one particular issue there, which I think is very important. But the Howrah Foundry, one of the things that is mentioned by the researcher is instead of moving to this new, yet unfinished industrial estate that the government of Bengal has been planning from 2009, was supposed to finish in 2014, has not yet finished going on. The other option is to simply sell the asset that they currently have to a real estate developer and sit on that particular gains in some sense, right? So, whereas if you look at the other industrial clusters, which are essentially based in and around smaller towns and structures, and of course, Aligarh and Jalandhar are struggling in different ways, that tension is not as extreme. So that's the other issue, and that's important because big cities have many other advantages that it brings to industry. But if what we are seeing is in these clusters, that even in the more dynamic cluster in Kolkata, which is the one in Metiya Bruce, the real growth in terms of exports, etc., is happening in industrial estates that are being set out in the outskirts of Kolkata and Barasat and so on. So that's the second issue about location and the role of big cities and smaller towns in some way. The third part is there's a lot of discussion and about clusters, and I think it's a very, as Sunil pointed out at the beginning, it's a very important component of the study to look at these cluster stories. And what comes out, of course, is the diversity of the benefits from clusters. So you have Rajkot and Morbi, and even for that matter, Metiya Bruce, definitely Tirupur, all of them sort of feeding off each other, even though there is a lot of competition within. And then you have this wonderful vignette. I will recommend whoever sort of reads the book to go to page, I think it's 187, where they talk about the Howrah Foundry cluster and how two different social groups have almost no knowledge of one group, which is into exports, the other group, which is not. The president of the association has no idea what the vice president of the association is doing, and the local district industry center has no idea what either the vice president or the president is doing, right? So it is a story of collapse of social capital, of state involvement, of many different things, which sort of leads to, but it is localized because right across the river in Kolkata, the garment structures is a whole different story altogether, right? But the real missing piece across all the various cluster stories is what you would expect from an urban space, is what we call thick labor markets and in some sense economies of scope, where you are not only feeding off your own industries, economies kind of story, but across cross-industry spillovers. And we don't see any of that cross-industry spillover story in any of these places. And that's one of the things to worry about in terms of when you're thinking about a broader manufacturing story. Skill labor, I know Srini did say that it is, my reading of the volume was slightly different in the sense that in Morbi and in Rajkot, there was definitely, I mean, at least from what I read from the chapters, it seems that in both these places, skill labor is a constraint. Both these places are places which are growing and trying to improve and move up. There's a lovely quote in the introduction, Nagaraja's introduction, from one of the Morbi manufacturers, who basically say that on a qualitative scale, if Italian tiles are 100, Morbi is at 5, but we're on a path to reach 25 soon. Right? These are people who are actually moving up the scale, but at the same time, I think that's where you come to hit against skill as a major structure, and the assumption that we sort of seem to have that industries and will somehow solve that problem themselves. And that, I think, is an unfair burden to put on them. And is definitely not a burden that the Chinese state puts on people. Right? And so that's one of the other issues. And then, and finally, to think about issues around the kind of support that you can provide from the state itself. One of the critical issues that come about is twofold. One, you realize how important logistics is, because while at one level Morbi is able to export better because it now has this nice new road to Kandla, it also is very hard for it to compete with Chinese imports landing in Chennai because the logistics costs are killing them. Right? And then there is the GST story. And the GST story, the problem is that not only are there a variety of other structures and so on and so forth, it is the cash flow story that really is killing them. Because they have to make these payments before they actually receive the revenues. And that sort of generally makes life very miserable, especially when you combine it with the finance story that is coming down. Right? So in sum, what I would say in conclusion is what we need, the big lesson that I've taken away from this volume is that there is definitely a very vibrant entrepreneurial class in different parts of this country. However, what we have not been able to provide them with confidence is the fact that if they actually invested, that the state would actually work lockstep with them, not only in terms of providing subsidies and financial support, those I think are less important, than a variety of other structures which involve investments in logistics, investment in skilling, and other kinds of taking the associations seriously so that you can actually build that ability to take the benefit of the cluster going forward. But each of them would also happen locally. And that is where our practice of having the local administration, especially the DM, change relatively rapidly, makes it a problem in contrast to the Chinese state, where the local state and especially the provincial, the city mayors, etc., have relatively long tenures and able to provide a certain degree of stability, which is not always seen in the Indian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pato. You have added further richness to this discussion. I think the point that you made about the local authorities' contribution in, say, for instance, in China, how proactively they work with the entrepreneurs to, handhold and support their operations is something we need to really learn and implement in the country. And so it is not for the government sitting in New Delhi to be looking after the entrepreneurs in the countryside and in the hinterland, but for the local authorities, they can play a very critical, very important role in taking their activities, entrepreneurial activities forward. So I think this is something which really comes out from all different studies on the Chinese, success and the clusters here, So wherever they worked, they delivered, more being a shining example. So thank you very much for your insights, Partha. Now I turn to our next panelist, who is Professor Padmini Swaminathan. She is former director of MIDS, Madras Institute of Development Studies, and she is a board member of ISID. And so we work very closely with her, and she provides a lot of guidance to our work in our, research advisory committee. Also, she chaired and all that. So, and very distinguished economist in her own right, especially she has been writing on labor, employment, and MSME related issues for a long time. So over to you, Padmini.
Thank you. I want to thank CDS-ISID and our editor, R. Nagaraj, for this opportunity to share my take on this very important and engaging book. I have read all the chapters, Nagaraj.
Thank you.
And I want to congratulate all the authors who are very established scholars with long years of experience in their respective fields, or rather clusters, for the interesting field work that have been carried out under this project, and it has provided very valuable insights. What I plan to do is that, because quite a few points have been covered, already been covered, so I'm not summarizing what I felt was a very important aspects of this thing. Nagaraj has already covered the entire thing. What I want to say is that what we've been discussing so far are the hardcore economists. What I find very interesting in the particular book and in each of the chapters, what I find is a large number of non-economic factors which are equally important and which have a bearing on how that particular cluster is actually functioning. And one of the classic things about the cluster that we have studied over a long period of time is that how the economic and the non-economic factors interact to give the cluster a particular, and tell us why it functions in a particular manner. So when you are comparing and saying that something is functioning in a particular cluster and some other cluster is not functioning, giving the same kind of milieu in which they function, that is a country in which they are functioning, we also need to go beyond the economic factors. And several of the, and almost all the authors have also pointed it out, though they may not have elaborated on it, given the fact that we think as economists, we don't have to do that, that is somebody else's job or something of that sort. So what I have done is that I have tried to cull out some of the non-economic factors to me, which to me are extremely important. A couple of them have already been covered by Professor Partha in his this thing. Now, what okay, so what I've said is that each paper in the book makes no, before that, when I come to is that one very important takeaway from this whole thing is whether it is a growing cluster or it is at this thing, one finds that as far as labor is concerned, there is a phenomenal increase in contractualization. So even in Morbi, you find that a cluster that we are celebrating today in this particular thing, we still find that contractual labor is the order of the day that we are actually talking about. So phenomenal increase in contractualization and goes with whatever may be the conditions under which these contracts. They may be getting more than minimum wages, better wages than outside, but it still is a contract labor that we are actually talking about. So each paper in the book makes several important observations that go beyond economics, thereby providing glimpses of what contributes to collective failure of the Indian economy to rise to its potential. One of the things that Nagaraj himself has pointed out in his in the book, but not as highlighted very much in the today's this thing, is that low investment in R&D and no incentive to take a basic research such that despite the Make in India rhetoric, the import content of the new product continues to remain high when compared to conventional ones. Okay. Now, what I want to go beyond that is, suppose you take Madhuri Saripalli's work, she emphasizes the need to introduce quality and safety as behavioral attitudes in the course curriculum and not as mere checklists to be followed. And I think that for me, that was a very important point, because if you only stick to it as some kind of checklist, you will say, okay, is that a quality or not quality? But he's actually going beyond and saying it has to be something which has to be internalized. So you're talking about behavioral economics here and saying how quality and safety has to be behavioral attitudes rather than mere checklists to be followed. Now, Vijay Bhaskar points out that social networks seldom go beyond the scale of the cluster. Cotton yard traders and exports are controlled by a traders' lobby that seldom interact with garment producers. Respondents point out that traders are a strong lobbying body and prevent policymakers from intervening to regulate prices. My point is, what is required here is a political solution for an economic resolution. I'm not getting into the point that Shiti has made because that has already been pointing out about that has already been pointed out by Partha, where he says that the future of Dharavi's leather cluster is closely tied to the state's ideas about land use planning. So international media has been quick to celebrate the achievements of Dharavi's people, but closer home plans are being made to uproot its industries and displace its people. So that is so some of these observations to me are very important. So I could go on. Almost all recommendations contained in each of the papers require to be resolved politically, either at the national or subnational level. Hence, a larger question for debate here is, do we have an industrial policy that not just recognizes the immense contribution of the clusters of industries across the country, but also has an agenda to dynamize their activities and strengthen the twin objectives of export-oriented industrialization and decent employment? Now, what are the other equally important takeaways for me are the following. One is what has been mentioned and which is part of the cluster literature that classic literature that we have is social embeddedness of business. Is an important non-economic factor that needs to be not only recognized, and it has been done by Keshav and Dinesh and Amita, but they have done it in passing. But one that requires greater in-depth study by economists if we need to understand why clusters like Rajkot, Morbi, and to some extent Tirupur perform the way they do. This becomes all the more important when one contrasts the performance of Morbi Rajkot with, say, the Howrah Foundry study or the Aligarh Law Law Cluster. So while discussing the production organization, I'm not getting into the detail that has already been provided by Partha. But for me, the important thing is the scholar who has done the Howrah Foundry study. The author emphasizes the important role played by intermediaries in units where owners simply rented out the premises. So you have a situation here where the author, the intermediaries, the units, owners have simply rented out the premises, and which to me appeared like the erstwhile absentee landlord phenomenon in agriculture. A little later, when discussing the institutional and technological challenges, the author notes the lack of cooperation among foundry owners, and that is where the important point about Marwadis and Bengalis come into the picture here. My point, in addition to what Partha sir has already pointed out, what the author does not do well in his paper is integrating his finding of the social composition and consequent behavior of the entrepreneurs with the structure of production. So the structure of production and structure of ownership are discussed in silos. So that is where I feel that these two things become extremely important. And the moment you start looking at it that way, it gives you a clue to how that particular cluster is functioning or not functioning. Even more intriguing to me is the case of the Jalandhar Sports Equipment Manufacturing Cluster. The bulk of the units here, over 70%, whether big, medium, or small, are owned by scheduled castes. Scheduled caste workers also constitute a majority in both small enterprises and exporting firms. And yet we have a scenario where apparent social cohesion has not translated into a vibrant business, particularly for the micro and small enterprises. In fact, the author talks of continuous worsening of business performance for these enterprises, which has therefore not contributed to quality employment for the workers. So my question is, how do we understand and interpret the above? While the Patel Prajapati dominance seems to have worked in Gujarat, the scheduled caste ownership cum scheduled caste worker combination and domination has not done the same for Jalandhar. The question that I ask myself is, if social cohesion is a necessary condition for growth and revival of a cluster, what more is required to make it a sufficient condition? In such a context, my question to the editor is, do we at the end of the day consider Howrah Foundry, the Aligarh lock industry, or the Jalandhar sports equipment manufacturing industry as even clusters in the way received literature describes them? I have the last point that I want to make is on China, because one of the major things about it is the comparison with China. And all I want to say here is that there are very, very important insights that have been provided by the volume on this comparison with China. And my addition to what they've already said is, I want reference to a particular book that has been edited by Narasimha Reddy and Kailas Saraf in 2017, which is called Rural Labor Mobility in Times of Structural Transformation, Dynamics and Perspectives from Asian Economies, that has been published by Palgrave Macmillan. Yeah. Now, in that, there are two papers by Chinese scholars, and both of them deal with the issue of land in China. And what they are talking about, I'm not getting into more details. What they're talking about is that there was a land management law that was passed. And what this land management did was it enabled the Chinese authorities to acquire land for this kind of eminent domain or for national for interest. So what has been made possible through that land acquisition is virtually provide land free for industrialization. So you've completely cut down the cost on this thing. What is my point again is that when we resort to comparisons with China, it is also time that we as economists demonstrate that Chinese economic achievements are deeply embedded in its politics, most of which at the current juncture cannot be emulated by our country. Hence, several of our policy recommendations could be non-starters unless we can rework them imaginatively for political feasibility. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Padmini, for adding a lot of richness to this discussion, especially by talking about the non-economic factors. And there are many which come into play in clusters and any industrial unit for that matter. So thank you very much for that. Let me turn to our last distinguished panelist, that is Professor Vikas Rawal. And of course, at the end, we will have some, sort of closing remarks by Anvesha Rana, the commissioning editor of Cambridge University Press. But among the eminent panelists, I have now Professor Vikas Rawal, who again is very well known to this audience, has been a constant contributor to the development literature, especially on agriculture-related themes. Labor very much figures in his research, and he is a professor at JNU, the Center for Economic Studies and Planning. So over to you, Professor Rawal.
Very much, Nagesh, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this very interesting conversation. I must start by congratulating Professor Nagaraj and all the authors for this very, very interesting volume that has been produced. It is, as Nagaraj absolutely rightly said, it's very timely, it's very important. It is a very important attempt to cover, I think, what was one of the most important gaps in our understanding of how Indian economy has grown in the last 3 decades. So this is an extremely important volume. A lot has been said by speakers before me, so that makes it challenging to speak, but I just have a few things to add to what has been said. I think one thing I must say is that the book is very interesting, very valuable at one level, but I think while it is so, it is also putting us putting to us an agenda for a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. I think, and this is important from from different perspectives. One is, of course, as you can see, the book, the studies that have been included in the book cover a few clusters. There are many other states which are missing, where there are many important clusters which need to be studied, which are obviously not part of this book. But this book tells you how important it is to do this kind of work, and I hope this book would catalyze studies of this kind. This book would create interest among younger scholars to take this as an example and do more of this work. But I think this book also sets a new research agenda because of the new context that has come about since this work was done. We've gone through this COVID pandemic in which all kinds of new challenges have come up. And these challenges have particularly hit the small industries very hard. Some of these clusters are likely to be hit very hard because of the economic problems that have been created over the last two years. Now, that again makes it all the more important that even these clusters be revisited to now look at what has happened over the last 2 years because of the problems that are more recent. So, there is a whole sort of set of reasons why one hopes that this book would not be an end, but would actually be a starting point of a program of research. I would like to in terms of substance, engage with 2 issues. One is, it was pointed out, the whole issue of forward and backward linkages. In fact, you made the point about, how manufacturing sector has forward and backward linkages. That's something that one needs to explore. What has happened with the large organized sector becoming, more and more sort of dependent on imports, and what has happened to linkages between clusters of this kind, and large-scale organized manufacturing. Now, in the pre-liberalization period, a lot of clusters had been there was an effort, conscious effort. There were policies to try and develop clusters around large-scale manufacturing industries. Most of the clusters that we are talking about here are clusters that essentially are producing consumer goods and are not really feeding to large-scale organized manufacturing. Now, what about that? I mean, is that still a possibility? What is the potential of that? How important it is to strengthen that? So that's one thing that comes to my mind, needs to be explored. The second thing, I think, the question, it is very clear. Nagaraj explained it very, very, very clearly, that the lack of state support is really the most important constraint that these firms face. I think the other side of which has been discussed, and different speakers have expressed it differently. Partho had a different perspective. Srinivasan had a different perspective. Padmini brought in a whole different angle to it, which is the question of skill. I think that's a question that needs to be explored a little more. I remember there is in one of the papers there's a discussion about, in fact in a section that has skill in its headline, the difference between the time it takes to make a t-shirt in Tirupur and the time it makes to make a t-shirt in China. Now the point is that the comparison is not necessarily telling you about difference in the workmanship of the person who's making the t-shirt. It is perhaps a difference in technology and a whole lot of other things which actually result in the fact that the person who's making the t-shirt in Tirupur takes longer than the person who's making a t-shirt in China. Now, it is important to be cautioned and not to easily fall into the trap of identifying this with workmanship and poor workmanship. And I think here as was pointed out, the whole Skill India program, the emphasis that's being given to strengthening skill is somewhat misplaced. It's not lack of skill, and in fact acquiring skill is not particularly the most difficult challenge. It is other support that I think is a bigger issue. That said, there is also another aspect to how a lot of Indian manufacturing works, and Morbi is perhaps a good example. This point was made about the quality of tiles being produced in Morbi and the quality of tiles being produced in Italy. There is a demand in India for cheap, low quality products. And a lot of these clusters, a lot of these industries are able to meet that demand. They meet that demand working with the contract workers that Padmini was talking about, where quality control of workers is not the big issue. The quality control of the manufacturing process, the machinery, the way the manufacturing process is organized, the way quality control processes are implemented in the firm, those are not terribly important, because the product that you're eventually going to sell, the quality of that product is not really terribly important. I had an opportunity to work on a research project led by Dr. Jasim Pais some years back on combine harvester manufacturing in Punjab. There are these small combine. It was a very interesting cluster in Nabha, where there was a large number of firms manufacturing combine harvesters. They're all making the same combine harvester. They've been making that combine harvester the same design, the same thing for decades. Now, there is a reason. One could identify factors why combine harvesters made practically with just a hammer and a cutting machine and a welding machine was more popular than combine harvesters being made by John Deere or something like that. There is a demand for cheaper, that kind of product which is easily serviced, which is made locally, which is easily acquired, easily serviced, and all kinds of things. Now that there is a demand for that. Now, when I think what does seem to be coming out from the studies is that if it comes to reaching a different market, if you have to reach out to an export market where you need to produce, for which you need to produce, which is of a higher quality, that's where you face a problem. So, improvement of quality, I think, is an important issue, but it would perhaps be wrong to, blame it on workmanship. I mean, I think the issues of quality are part of a larger problem that some of this manufacturing is trapped in. In some cases, they're able to survive and grow despite that, because of the nature of demand that they have. In some cases, that becomes a constraint because the demand is not there, or because better quality product is now coming from China or somewhere else. So there are these issues. I think to end. A lot of these issues are dealt with by authors in this volume. A lot more needs to be done on these issues because, as I said, there are many more clusters, many states, many areas where such work needs to be done, and also because there are new challenges that have come up in front of us, and we need to do something about them. Thank you. I think I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Vikas. Very interesting.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Who is that? Yes. So very interesting insights to add to what was a very rich discussion already, and you have highlighted very well, the importance of the study of these clusters, and what you said in the beginning, I totally agree with. Like any good research, it raises more issues and questions, and requires a greater in-depth study of clusters around the country, and the richness of lessons that is coming out from this volume needs to be sort of replicated, and we need to understand what is going on much more fully, so that policymakers can take note of that. Now, having heard all our key speakers, I want to just check with Anvesha if she wants to come in now or towards the end, because I want to have some small discussion among the participants. I'm sure there are, some of them wanting to make, some points of or questions to Nagaras or other authors. Anvesha, are you there? Doesn't seem to be there. It doesn't matter. So let me just look around. Who wants to, start a discussion? I see a hand of Shilo, and I presume Satyaki, who is also a contributor and is present, would want to say something. And any other. So please feel free to raise your hands. And I just want to give the floor to Shilo Chatterjee. You have the floor, Shilo.
Thanks very much, Nagesh. I was very happy to hear this fascinating discussion, and thank you very much for inviting me to this. I think this is a very major puzzle in the Indian economy, what to do about employment. And we have heard a lot about manufacturing and so on and so forth. Of course, we know that the largest employer is the unorganized sector in industry. And as Professor Nagaraj pointed out, this is a large, big hole in our information base. We just don't know anything about it. The surveys that are done are very dated. I don't see why the first and major policy of government should not be taking out regular surveys on the MSME sector. That is the first thing that should be done, and I hope ISID will take up with the government on this issue. because without knowing what and how this sector is working, is functioning, we cannot frame any policies. We can go about and making small studies, looking at clusters and so on and so forth, which will provide a lot of insights, but we must go ahead and try and provide the data. And this is the first and most important responsibility of the government. If it's really serious about employment, let's see what the situation is. What are the real needs of the MSME sector? We can't just rely on ad hoc studies to tell us this. This is one.
Yeah.
The second thing is we heard a lot about manufacturing industries, but not too much about agro-industrial industries and rural industries. What are their kind of sort of linkages and so on and so forth? Their issues may be a little bit more different. As I understand, China, the basic industrialization that took place was in rural industries, sort of enterprises, and we do not have, I think, too much of those. Or do we? I don't know. We need to understand that sector. The third thing is something which Professor Rawal mentioned, which is about the linkages between large industries and the MSME sector. This is very critical. Because what are the relationships? And I understand that relationships are of two different power levels. The large industries do not provide, on an equity-based kind of relationship with the small industries. Often, small enterprises are unable to recover, dues from the large industries, and they go bankrupt. So there needs to be laws and rules and institutions to protect the sector from, to create a level playing field between the large and the small, and to improve the relationship between the two. Finally, when we're talking about jobs, I think we may need to look beyond the manufacturing sector and go into construction. Construction is an area which has great potential. And time and again, particularly when we are expanding our, let's say, infrastructure in the country, I think with adequate and with proper technology, not using a very high capital intensive technology, but using more labor intensive technology, we can, with large growth in infrastructure, we can create more jobs through this sector rather than relying on manufacturing alone. Thank you. Let me stop.
Thank you, Shilo, especially for
Thank
your
you, sir.
point.
Thank you, sir.
Who is that?
I'm Girish, sir.
Yeah. So, what do you want to say? You don't have to say thank you every time. Yeah. So, Shilo, the point about the surveys, they have been actually making a lot of noise about this census of small scale industries not being held after 2006. I think this is very important point that you have made, and we will continue to press the government for taking it up. So I see a number of hands on the screen. Let me begin in the same order. Akhilesh, then Suma, then Satiki. So Akhilesh, you have the floor. My colleague from my side.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And personally, I congratulate Nagaraj sir and the team. Very nice work and insightful. Basically, it has generated more interest in me to pursue this area for the further research. In 2019, I conducted a study on MSME, and I surveyed some areas in Delhi and six districts in Uttar Pradesh, and for assessing the credit problems of those industries. And even in the cluster area, like in Agra, we surveyed, we found the infrastructure issue is a very serious issue. And just besides the main road, the roads that is connecting to the clusters, to the main roads and the other stuff are not very well. So I fully agree with Nagaraj sir that the infrastructure issue, even in Delhi, the Anand Parvat area, the entrepreneurs told me that they manage their water supply themselves. So this is the infrastructure problems is the serious problem. And the other problem is that the role of the government agencies, that is the DIC. We interacted with the DIC persons, and we found that there is the lack of connectivity between the entrepreneurs and the DIC, the agencies that are there to support the entrepreneurs. And even I had a opportunity to study in 2007. I found that the data that is maintained by the DIC, they are not up to date. Even they are just matching with the government data, ESI data, and the central government data, but they are not matching the data with the ground. It means that if particular industry that is running in the record book of the DIC centers, if you are going to visit that centers, you will find either that industry is closed down or not at that place. So data discrepancy is there, and data is really very serious issue. What Professor Nagaraj sir raised, that we need a national level census for the MSME sectors. Unfortunately, it has been stopped after the year 2006. The other problem is that I would like to highlight is that the government policies is Bhadohi, there is the Kalin industry, that this is the Kalin clusters. In most of the entrepreneurs, they told that earlier the government was offering some incentive for the exports, but suddenly they stopped it. So the abrupt government policies are also responsible for a sector that is growing at some stage of time and not growing at present. So this is also the problem, that there is the disconnect between the government policies and the need of the entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
This is the problem. Yeah, sir. Just one point, sir. Yeah, 1 point. The other, the access to problem. For that, we found that in general, all the discussion panelists, they are just talking about the lack of the government agencies and the failure from the government part. But I personally realized that this is some entrepreneurial mindset problem from the entrepreneurs also. They are not coming forward for the registration, and that's why we have the huge informal sectors. And that's why even government is willing to help the government, but the government is willing to help the entrepreneurs, but government is not able to provide them the sufficient support in terms of the policy and other issues. So I think this is the two-side problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Suma, over to you.
Thank you. I found the whole panel discussion as well as the presentation by Sunil and Professor Nagaraj very interesting. I don't know much about the developments in the Indian economy, but I think the last serious work that I did on it was in 1994, perhaps. But I was just wondering, given those discussions in the 1990s, whether this growth of the unorganized sector that was highlighted by Professor Nagaraj in his presentation actually represents maybe the consequence of both making it easier to set up business and a loosening of labor laws. You know, these were the big reforms that were being thought about in the 1990s, and lots of people thought that loosening labor laws was going to be very bad for the economy. But perhaps, you know, it enabled the emergence of this kind of unorganized sector. And I think that should not be that hard to study if you have even district data, because labor laws are by state, aren't they? So that's one sort of thought I had, whether this development is linked to that kind of policy discussion. The second thing I wondered about was the lack of data, which so many of the people discussing the paper and also Professor Nagaraj himself alluded to. Isn't it possible, having the location information, to be able to web scrape some data on these companies? I mean, is that not a possibility? Do we have to rely on a government survey? Would we not be able to find this by scraping websites and, you know, like people are doing in other parts of the world? So you can get some idea of salaries by going through Glassdoor. So I just put that as something that might be interesting to explore. That's it. 2 questions.
Thank you. Satyaki, again, quickly, because we would like to wind it up by, if possible, by 5 o'clock.
Can I ask a question, please? Sir,
I mean, a small
Professor
question.
Indira,
Yeah.
After
After Satyaki, I will invite you, Professor Hirabe.
So shall I ask the question?
After Satyaki, I have already.
Okay. That's fine.
Go ahead, Satyaki.
So I want to make 2-3 points. One is regarding this linkage between large and small enterprises. What many of the clusters, which were traditional clusters, and new areas are emerging as additions to those clusters. We also see a kind of dualist structure emerging within the cluster. So the modern sector or modern entrepreneurs, large-scale enterprises which are emerging using new machines and mostly export-oriented, are not necessarily linked to the traditional sector. They are catering to two different markets. So a new kind of disconnect is also emerging. The second is regarding the skill and the question that also came in the discussion, is that it is also interesting to see in many of the traditional clusters, basically producing garments or foundries, or in these cases, what we see mostly labor intensive. There is not much difference in terms of skill and workmanship between producers or workers who are working in the domestic enterprises, catering to the domestic market, and those who are producing in the export market. It is basically the same number multiplied into larger plants, nothing more than that. The third point which I want to mention is that if we really want to have a modern SMEs or modern clusters, the way it emerged in case of Italy or in Latin American countries, also we need to see it has to be backed with macro policies, because at what level of demand that is there, which was raised by Professor Vikas also, that if you have a demand of a low-end, low-quality product because of the inequality that is emerging, then of course low-end, low-productivity clusters would also thrive. So if we have to have a modern SME clusters, we need to have a higher growth of middle-class segment. That happened in China, but it didn't happen the way it happened in China in case of India. That's all.
Thank you. Professor Hirve?
I have a question. We have seen, the studies have shown, first of all, let me say that I really enjoy the discussion. This is not strictly speaking, my area, but this was really very, very interesting. My question is that when excess of credit to MSMEs is not enough, thanks to large and corporate sector to a certain extent, what can we do to the rising or, uncontrollable buying of different sectors by Adani's and Ambani's? They are diversifying into large number of other sectors globally, India and outside, and the concentration of power is taking place over there, which is affecting credit and scope for other industries also. Now, is there any law which can prevent this? Because I think MRTP, after MRTP has gone, we have competition law, but competition law doesn't seem to be doing enough. So what can we do to that? That's my question, because it's my genuine question. Because I observe that happening every day and everywhere, and still we can't do anything, it looks like.
Yeah, very important question indeed. So I think
one thing Anvesha has written in a message that she is throughout the discussion, but somehow her audio is not working.
Yes,
so
I saw that message. Yeah. Well, I want to first invite Nagaraj to respond, if he likes to respond to any of some very important points have been made. And then I will check if Anvesha wants to say a few things, and then I'll just wind up the discussion. So Nagaraj, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for the questions. I'll respond to the questions being posed to me. First set of questions, a survey of MSMEs. I agree there's a need for data on MSMEs. And in fact, in my introduction, I've explained why we had to do field work. Ideally, we should have complemented our field work with studies of the secondary data. but the secondary data is so dated and inadequate that we could not do any studies on secondary data. So that's that answer. And we all agree, I think a large cross-section of audience here agree with me that there's a need for better data. Yes, rural industries is missing. I admit that. And as I said, ideally we would have liked to have covered a much larger cross-section of industries. But let me also, I think my co-authors in the volume will bear me out that I thought we should concentrate on modern small-scale industries. So I remember when Keshav said, "Can we study traditional industries?" Like I think I did not respond. I must admit, this is maybe my fault. I did not respond enthusiastically to that. So we thought, I was thinking, maybe it's my personal bias, but I thought we must focus on modern small-scale industries. So that gets reflected. Maybe there's a scope for doing traditional industries. Maybe that's a job for future. Okay. Linkages between large and small firms are studied in some cases, but not very much. I think Satyaki has answered that question, and Satyaki's work itself shows very closely. But studying inter-firm relationships is very hard. In fact, there is a whole, in fact, Satyaki's study and also my understanding, there's a very, very detailed subcontracting relationship between large international brands in Calcutta and the household industries in slums of Calcutta, like brands like, fancy Indian ethnic brands, Mohe and what is this? Fancy, luxury brands. They have intricate design work. All that apparently is done in the slums of Calcutta. It moves up to the brand through a very intricate network of inter-firm relationships. But it's very difficult to trace some of them. But some of it is traced by Satyaki, but I think there's a scope for doing more work. But it is very hard because standard tools of economic analysis does not allow them to be followed. That's a problem. Okay. Yeah, jobs beyond manufacturing. Yes, as we know, construction has been a far bigger employment generator than manufacturing, which we agree. But that is outside the scope of the present study. That's what I think. Okay. Yes, Akhilesh talked about his field work, and he seemed to bear out many of the findings. What we found out. Thank you for agreeing with. Find your findings similar to what we have found. Okay. I think Suma Atre asked about ease of doing business, and I think I'm not so sure about the factors she talked about. Labor law reforms. See, labor law is not an issue in small-scale industries. In fact, in all the cases, all the clusters I went, I asked, and this is a question I repeatedly asked people, administration people, the industry association people, and the entrepreneurs, do you have a labor problem? In fact, we did not come across anywhere. Okay, I think this is the whole labor issue, and maybe this explains my bias, but I must say it's overblown, especially in the international literature or India. I think it's overdone. Okay, and ease of doing business has done nothing. And as we all know, ease of doing business is a bogus index. I've written about it. I think one can look at it. Okay, I think that's Professor Hirve sought to enlarge the scope of this work in looking at Adani and Ambani and MRTP. I think that's beyond the scope of this book. But I understand. But the point I was referring to in my presentation was today. In fact, one of the most recent moves is Adani Capital is joining State Bank of India as a co-lender. There's a new scheme called co-lending coming up. Okay, this is in effect backdoor entry of big capital, big private capital into banking business, which has been opposed by various governments. I think even the most, I would say, people across the economic spectrum, I mean, in terms of their views, have opposed it. It is not good. And it doesn't happen even in a country like US. But in India, there's a strong pressure to do it for political reasons. So this co-lending is a backdoor entry of big capital like Adani and Ambani into State Bank of India. And this is certainly deleterious for agriculture and small enterprises. So I think in the long run interest of the nation, I think it's a negative. I share the concern which Professor Hirve mentioned. I think I have sought to answer all the questions. I think I'm done. Yes.
Thank you very much, Nagaraj, for taking up the questions and responding to them. So it's now time for me to thank everyone and close. And I don't think it is possible to summarize what was a very rich discussion in a few minutes. But I think it has, as expected, raised many issues. Jobs, criticality of jobs, and responding to that comes out very clearly. The manufacturing's importance for bringing about some change and creating more jobs also comes out very clearly. And the fact that industrial policy matters. Industrial policy, not only at central level, but state and local levels matters. It's not only about providing just infrastructure and highways, but also hand-holding in various ways, and demonstrated by Morbi's success story. It matters. And it is not about just economic factors, but non-economic factors also equally important and critical. The need for better data, which was highlighted in the discussion, and government needs to provide that to be able to allow and enable better analysis for policy prescriptions and agenda for more work. I think that, like any good research, it has raised a number of questions which need to be taken up by more, structured analysis of industry in small, large, medium, all different levels and all different places. So I think we have had a very wholesome discussion this afternoon. I don't think this time could have been better spent, than discussing all of these issues. And for that, I really want to thank our, speakers for this afternoon. First of all, to CDS and Sunil for joining and collaborating with ISID for this productive discussion, and also support of Cambridge University Press. And then Nagaraj, and Sunil both setting the tone of this discussion, and all of these very eminent panelists, Srini, Partho, Padmini, and Vikas, contributing to this debate and enriching this. And then also in the discussion, some of you, we brought some very interesting insights. So I'm really grateful to all of you. Thank you very much, and a big hand to everyone. So I just want to ask if Anvesha wants to say one word for closing this discussion, if your audio is working now.
Is this working? I'm not certain. Can
Yes,
you?
It is working.
Okay.
It is working.
Okay. I'm very sorry for this confusion.
Over to you. So,
I'm very sorry for the
can,
confusion.
You can really close the. You have the final word.
Yeah. Thank you. My internet has been bad, which is why my video is also not working. So I'm very sorry for this mess. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been very great for us to work on this book, and it marks a long association that we have had with Professor Nagaraj. And the most wonderful part for me as an editor at Cambridge is that new relationships always develop by working on these books. So this is our second edited volume with Professor Nagaraj, and all contributors from both volumes that have been, our associations with them have developed in various ways. Some of them have become our wonderful authors, some of whom are on this panel today. I see them here, like Professor Dr. Shatuki Roy. There are so many others, and that is really the most rewarding part for us as the press. And also, I really feel the sense of belonging and a sense of community, as Dr. Kumar began by saying that it is, it's a it's a community of friends that have come here to join this book panel discussion. And this is the same thing that is reflected across spaces now. Now we are on Zoom. Hopefully in a few months, we will all see each other at the ISLE conference if that is able to happen. And these are the spaces where we also look forward to very much, not only as an editor who has to work for the press and it is my work to commission books, to bring your wonderful research together and to eventually publish them. But also as an individual, I always think how much I'm learning because it's not my subject expertise. And in the several years that I have been in publishing, every new avenue opens up like this. And I'm very thankful to all of you for that, for fostering this sense of community, for academic research, and the entire support that I receive always from, as a representative of the press, where people come forward, and Cambridge's presence in India is not as old as Sage or Oxford or other academic publishers. But it is the faith of the academic community in India and also globally that has really helped our program flourish a lot. And I can encourage all of you, and I'll request you to please look at the publishing program that we work on. There are, as I said, a number of authors here, and there are more works in progress that will come from CDS, from ISID, and I can only hope for this to keep flourishing. Thank you so much, everyone, once again, and my apologies for the mess with the audio and the video.
Thank you very much, Anvesha. And so I think it's time to say really thank you very much and bye-bye. So
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a nice weekend.
We'll remain engaged.